Hi guys, good morning. Today, Sarisht will be giving the talk. He's a PhD candidate at Duke University, and he's advised by Kartik and Fan. And he works on consensus and game theory kind of stuff. And today, he's going to be presenting security of blockchains with strategic players. All right, Sarisht, take it up.
Thank you so much. Hey everyone. Uh, as Varun mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at Duke, co-advised by Kartik Nayak and Professor Zhang. Um, and today, I will be talking about some of my research in the field of security of blockchains. And in particular, I would be focusing a bit more on the latest research, which is the inclusionless design. Okay. Okay. So before I get started over here, let me tell you a little bit of a story about how I got into blockchains. The very first thing that somebody told me about how, or to motivate me towards blockchains was this. Imagine that I go to a bank. I try to deposit some money in this bank. The bank takes my money, but it does not update my balance. The bank is somehow malicious in this. What exactly can I do? The I just lost all the money that I tried to deposit in the bank. Surely I can go to the judiciary and ask for justice, but how do I even prove that I made this deposit? When I'm depositing this cash, nobody would be able to know anything. Well, that was the big problem with centralization. And in general, there was just too much authority for traditionally trusted institutes. And if they got corrupted, there is basically nothing that you can do about it. They can stop trades on your on a dime. They can manipulate the price that you're getting. Say you're depositing $100, but your account only gets $20 updated in your account, and so on and so forth. There is literally nothing that you would be able to do after that. This brought me to blockchains, a means where you don't need to trust any of these traditional institutes, but just like a set of parties or just yourself in general. Well, not really no trust. You don't need to trust, like, you'd still need to trust some collective where the trust is in multiple different parties and any of whom can process your transaction. So even if like one of these parties is good, um, they would process my transaction at least. Um, in other words, blockchains promised us a decentralized system where the transactions were executed trustlessly. However, this promise today looks a little broken. If we look at today's state of blockchains and especially large chains like Ethereum, um, that promise is not really being upheld. Two parties are basically accounting for more than 90% of builder blocks that are built, which means if these parties somehow get malicious, I'm back in the same scenario and I'm not really getting much progress. Well, we are getting a lot of progress in the sense that my money can't be stolen now. There is atomicity involved and other things, but and there have been a lot of improvements, but the promise of blockchains is not being fulfilled at this point. Uh, Basically, given that these parties are centralized, my transactions can still be stopped if the party wants for a long time, because again, 90% were being controlled. The rest 10% would come in expectation once every 10 blocks. And be honest, maybe. Or they can manipulate, if I'm trying to exchange, they can still manipulate the market price, um, and so on and so forth. As a notation, we'll be using this for denoting a trade. Um, going forward. So let me ask you this. Why was centralization a problem? I told you that the bank would like censor me and stop my transaction from going through and steal my money. Um, but uh, is there any benefit that they are getting from it? Obviously, like the bank is earning money, or whoever the central party is would be earning some money. The same is true for the centralization on chain. The parties who are actually misbehaving over here are just doing so in their best interest. They're just trying to earn money from whatever transaction you're sending. And this money could come in the form of a bribe from an external adversary, from a sandwich attack, or arbitrage, or other forms of MEV that exist. Again, I'm not going to go into details of how these attacks work and how these like sandwich attacks, arbitrage, and liquidation, etc. work. Later on, I will touch into liquidation a little bit, but for now, we can just say that there are sources of money where the central party, if they misbehave, they can earn some money somewhere. There is a caveat though, because it can't just do anything. It can do so only in the regime where there does not exist a proof for it being dishonest. For example, if I'm signing two different blocks, that's a very easy thing to prove that I'm misbehaving. And if there exists a proof of dishonesty, the party can be heavily penalized. But overall, the crux of all of these problems comes from the fact that whoever is producing these blocks can order transactions in a strategic manner, which means if, let's say, it is receiving a transaction, it can either sandwich it between other transactions that it creates or just completely exclude the transaction from the block. Well, there have been previous research which tries to counteract this with order policy enforcement through uh, threshold defense, basically, is what I'm terming it as, in which instead of a single party, you're sending the transaction to a trusted sort of committee of parties where, like, some threshold of these members are honest, and then whoever produces the block is somehow constrained in what it can do. They can either include the transactions in a blind format, which would imply that the transaction was encrypted, and when it is being included on chain, it is still like in an encrypted format. The committee would release it afterwards, uh, enforcing a blind order, or it could somehow be a constrained system where the transactions are like there is some sort of a timestamp or sequencing that is done by this trusted committee. Basically, you're taking the power away from the single party and truly decentralize it between multiple parties. However, does this solve the core problem that we started with? There is still money to be made, and therefore the first result that I'm going to present here is our impossibility result. There is no threshold defense that can enforce any order for these transactions. There are some caveats to it that user is ephemeral, committee is profit seeking, which is rational, transactions are binding, etc. But all in all, if you're trying to build a defense based on decentralizing the single source of failure to multiple parties, you're not really solving the problem here. Um, and as a sketch of this proof, I'll refer you to our paper, and which is in CCS 24, but also the previous talk that was given in this seminar by Mahimna on smart collisions. What it basically said was if there is a way for parties to collude and attack a system, they will be able to do so without leaving any trace. There can be no sort of a traitor tracing algorithm that can work over there. So what's next? Um, we have we've shown that the threshold defense area of this road is blocked, and therefore is really not what we can go for. But there is the other aspect of economic security where game theoretically, if you can make it so that the transactions are not even profitable to attack or reorder for the block proposer, then we still have some sort of a defense. It relies on uh, profit-making capacity of everyone, but it's a completely logical defense over there. And this is what I term as I and many others term as economic security for blockchains, where all parties are considered individually rational, which means that they're trying to seek money. And I have done some research on all of these. Based on economic security, I've proposed like three protocols for various different things. For example, a swap, which was a part of the same paper as the impossibility, um, and you can read through it. But for today, I'll be talking about AUCIL, which is an inclusion list designed for rational parties. Okay, so let's say, let's first define what censorship is. I talked about that the adversary has power to reorder transactions, but it also has this power that it can basically silence any transaction that is coming in. Let's say Alice has some position on some institute or on some exchange, and she wants to add some collateral to it. Uh, by adding more collateral, she can avoid liquidation because that's how liquidation works. Uh, but if the adversary sees this, it would not want Alice's transaction to go through because in that case, Alice can get liquidated and the adversary can somehow gain profit from this liquidation. So what it does is censor this transaction. Censorship in blockchains occurs when certain transactions are intentionally excluded. Um, for example, the adversary wants to censor the star transaction, and therefore it can basically stop, like if the block proposer stops this transaction from happening, from going into the slot, then it would be termed as censorship. And the centralization of the builder space actually exacerbates this issue. As shown in the chart, more than 90% of the transactions are actually being built by two builders, which is a pretty serious issue over here because the adversary just needs to bribe these two builders to exclude the transactions for a very long time. This undermines the censorship resistance of the chain significantly. To counter this, inclusion lists have been proposed as a solution for forced inclusion of some transactions. So these basically inclusion lists are lists of transactions that the builder must include in the blocks. And if the block does not contain this transaction, then it would be termed as invalid and it would be skipped, making the adversary not benefit from the censorship itself. Well, how exactly would we enforce this kind of a list from getting in? There are two enforcement models that are widely being used. One is a conditional one, and the other one is an unconditional. Um, Conditional enforcement is more akin to what we call a soft inclusion, in which transactions are required to be added in the block. However, if the block is full and there is no more space, then if you still leave out a transaction, that's fine. And therefore, it's not really a binding thing. If a transaction exists in inclusion list, it is just prioritized for inclusion. In systems like Ethereum, this is fine because, again, Ethereum only aims for 50% of the block being full. But other systems are which completely uses up their own block uh, might face issues if they're using conditional inclusion lists by filling because the blocks can be easily filled. And the other enforcement was unconditional enforcement, which basically means that any transaction that is present in the inclusion list has to be included in the block, regardless of whether the block is full or not. Our design would be based on the unconditional enforcement uh, over here. Um, yeah. Okay, so we talked about that the adversary cannot censor the transaction in the inclusion list, but why not censor the transaction from the inclusion list itself? Like if the adversary has money, somebody is going to be building this inclusion list. Why not just bribe that party instead? In addition, not instead. Uh, so to answer this question, we first need to answer who exactly is building this inclusion list? Should it be a single party? Should it be multiple parties together, somehow collaboratively building an inclusion list? Exactly, yeah. Let's just say that if you're using multiple parties, then who are these parties going to be? Is this going to be the builders, who are again very centralized? Is this going to be validators, who are relatively decentralized? Uh, but yeah, basically, multiple validator inclusion list protocols were introduced by Commerce. Um, and the basic idea of the design is as follows. The validators, they are collaboratively constructing inclusion list from the mempool. They'll uh, choose transactions which they see in the mempool and then aggregate them into a single inclusion list which is enforced. This basically decentralizes the process, but raises a lot of questions. The first question is, what transactions would each party choose? How would this aggregation occur? And various other things. And these basically form our goals that we want to follow, in which basically what we want is that any party who's rational should follow the honest protocol that we've laid out in front of them. Secondly, if some party for some reason crashes, our protocol should still move on and be live. And lastly, it should be robust against like bribery-based censorships where the adversary is trying to stop parties from including certain transactions. And in this effect, there has been a significant improvement in the past year where fossil was introduced, which laid the groundwork for inclusion lists. It was the first end-to-end inclusion list system that was introduced, and it used attesters, a very large set of parties who are fairly decentralized, as a means to verify that inclusion lists are indeed the union of all the, basically verify that the aggregation is done correctly. However, um, there are some problems with fossil. The first one being they're not working in the rational party setting. They're assuming that at least one party amongst the entire committee that they choose is honest, which is a fairly good assumption, not questioning that much. But they're also trusting majority attesters and requiring these attesters to be active. Both of these two are questions that I'm not really sure that in current Ethereum world are true. And therefore, um, sorry, I'll first stop here and ask if there are any questions and then proceed with our solution. Okay, so our solution, AUCIL, is as follows. There is a first phase where inputs for the transactions are being inputs for the inclusion list building protocol is being selected, and then these inputs would be broadcasted. And then there is a phase where everyone is aggregating all the things they see, uh, and this aggregation forms some sort of a bid where bid is basically the number of inputs that you're collecting from other parties. And the highest bid must be included by the block proposer. Um, so let's look at this step by step. In phase one, we have this input selection phase. We have some transactions that would be present in the mempool. And unlike in the conditional inclusion list schemes where you can just put in all the transactions in the mempool in your input list, um, you need to, as a rational party, you need to choose which inputs to add because you have limited space to add transactions, basically. What if we did not have this step? What if we just picked up the two highest paying transactions, let's say, and added that to our input list? Well, that does not form a equilibrium because other transactions might pay more uh, if they're included in an isolation than the top two transactions. Basically, we do an equilibrium analysis over there, and it is easy to see that it would not form a mixed Nash equilibrium. And basically, the adversary can come in and coordinate the game. So, what happens if we're not using any protocol? And like I said, that picking the top two transactions was not an equilibrium, but there always exists a mixed Nash equilibrium for any protocol selection, right? So, what if we just leave the parties to their own selves and to maximize their profits and expectation? Well, this leads us to something that is called utility left on the table, where adversary can come in and it can coordinate everybody while attacking. So let's say as an adversary, I want to censor a transaction, and I know that there is some utility that is left in the system that can be tapped into. Not only will I censor the transaction, I'll coordinate the game as well, such that all the utility or the maximum utility that can be derived is derived, and then make other parties whole while censoring the transaction. This makes it fairly easy for the adversary to basically censor the transactions. And thus, we need a dedicated selection phase. The selection phase that we use is a greedy selection um, based process, and then a round robin allocation of those transactions, which are greedily selected. The result of this would be a correlated equilibrium in which no party has any incentives to deviate from the suggested allocation. Let us look at this algorithm, and let us look at this in terms of how the fees varies in this. Let's say the first greedy selection would be for the star, which is the highest paying transaction, uh, but the resulting effective fees for this star now halves because this transaction would now be repeated two times if it is selected again. Similarly, this process is repeated, and whichever thing is giving us the highest utility is selected. This forms a selection, but not an allocation from which parties know exactly what to choose. These are the set of all transactions that will be going through in the system, but not who is selecting them. So to do that, we compute the final utility, sort it according to the final utility, and then do a round robin allocation of these. The resulting distribution forms a correlated equilibrium in which no party has any incentive to deviate. Um, and it is also fair, like if we um talk in terms of game theory notations, it would be an EFX fairness, where as long as you remove any transaction from an other party's list or allocation, you will have a utility from your own allocation greater than what the other party has. Okay, so that gives us our phase one. But what happens for the adversary in this case? Um, the adversary, if it wants to censor this transaction star, needs to bribe the first and the second party not to include the transaction in the mempool. And it turns out that based on our analysis and another analysis that was conducted before us, which is based on censorship resistance on on-chain auctions, that you would always need to bribe the full amount to each party instead of like distributing. And even though each of these parties is expecting a utility of 15 from the star transaction, the bribe would need to be 30 for the adversary to ensure that none of these parties include this transaction. And thus, it increases the amount that the adversary has to pay and scales it by the number of parties that actually choose the transaction. The next step for us would be aggregation, in which basically all the parties are now collecting these inputs that have been broadcasted into a bid, and the highest bid wins. Again, the bid is calculated by the number of inputs that you have. Uh, and let's say there is some sort of a reward, say 30 from winning this auction. Um, yeah. Now, one thing you would notice over here is that there is actually incentives for parties to not broadcast their input list. For example, for this third party, if it does not broadcast its input list, then it would always have a bid that is higher than the first and the second party, because it just has another input list its own to append to its bid. Um, However, it could also have happened that this party crashes, So we always need to move on if this party is truly crashing. Um, but obviously, if there is like if this party broadcasts, then there would not be any reason to drop it because the higher bid you have, the better. And while I'm saying there's no reason to drop it right now, this does not mean that it cannot be censored in a later phase due to bribes, etc. We will come back to the bribery game later on, but just as a standalone aggregation phase, if the party broadcasts, then there is no reason for dropping an input list. But as I mentioned earlier, what prevents this party from intentionally withholding its transaction or its inputs? Well, the first thing over here is that if they don't win, they would lose their fee as well. So if let's say somehow bid one or bid two is the winner bid, then the input list three did not get included in either of those two bids, which means that the fee that they were getting from the transactions does not go through to them. So how do we make sure that withholding does not uh, necessarily lead to winning? We do so by adding a verifiable random bias to these values of bits. So in addition to basically your the number of inputs that you're choosing, there is a random number that gets appended to it. And this random number basically implies that uh, like whatever the bid will be is heavily dependent on the input lists, but it is also significantly dependent on this random number. Um, this VRF number should not just be a very small value because otherwise it doesn't affect the game. And it should not be like very large either because if it is very large, then we revert back to a single leader game where a single party is aggregating, and then you can just bribe that party from excluded. Overall, we found a balance that square root of the number of parties seems like a very good area where we can have like the randomness in the range of 0 to square root of the number of parties. And if it such happens that this third party is generates a bias of 0.1, whereas other two parties have a high bias, then the Green Party would still win the auction, and therefore the Orange Party has incentives to broadcast. Well, uh, it does have incentives to withhold if it generates a bias within one of the maximum bias. And that is okay because in a number of parties, like the number of parties that we'll have in the game, will be more than 15, and therefore square root of n parties is fine to not broadcast. Yeah, basically that most parties are broadcasting. This is good enough for our censorship resistance, and therefore is something that we are going to use. So if we talk about the censorship resistance in this phase, then if if the adversary wants to censor the star transaction, if it would have to bribe all the parties to exclude two input lists altogether from their inputs. By doing so, it would basically be emptying out the bids of all of these parties. The winner would remain the same, but you'd still need to pay everyone everything. Um, and this is a extreme example where two input lists were needed to be stopped. But even if one input list was required to be stopped, the adversary will, you would think that it would need to only bribe two parties over here because the third one has a bias has anyways very low bias, and therefore even if these two parties reduced their inputs by one, it would have been fine. The answer is no. It actually is not, and the adversary still needs to bribe this third party as well, because the VRF value is unknown to the adversary, and therefore it would bribe it. It would reduce the um, it would reduce the bid for the third party as well, making the cost of censorship equivalently high across all parties. And this value of bribe must be greater than 30 each, because if I'm not paid more than 30, then I can just deviate and win the auction without the adversary getting to react to it. There is this third caveat, which I'm not presenting over here, which is regarding how these bids are going on chain, uh, which basically is just going to be a proof that the number of bids selected is greater than some threshold number of bids. And all of that is just good enough for the censorship that we have.
Sarisht, quick question. What is the
Yeah.
input to the VRF?
The input to the VRF is basically just your key and the block number. So let's say you're in slot 10, and you have your own like key. So it's the secret key that you'll use, and it is publicly verifiable with your public key after you release this value.
I see. So, but this is, so there's no, but this can be computed ahead of time, no? By, say, the parties, and then maybe if an adversary corrupts enough parties or can bribe enough parties at the beginning of time, can they not learn all the VRF values and then sort of know, okay, who has a good chance of winning at which round? If it's
Yeah,
a,
so you can so an adversary can bribe parties from to basically learn their VRF value, but we show that it is in the party's best interest to not share the VRF. Again, like if you're bribing them enough and you're corrupting them with by paying them 30, that is good enough. You'll learn the VRF. But let's say you're bribing 10, like which is less than what your auction result is, then it is not in the best interest of the party to share the VRF value as well. Uh, and you would know the VRF values of everyone who is bribed, but that does not inform you of anything that goes into the parties that are not bribed. Um, so the parties that you will not bribe will still can still have a VRF that is larger than all of your parties with some probabilities. And based on those probabilities, you'd still uh, get a very high censorship resistance.
I see. I see. Yeah, I guess this part kind of always confuses me. Like, why can't I just bribe someone to tell me their secret key? You know, like I'll pay you this much money, give me your secret key, and then forever I know what your VRF output is always going
Uh,
to be. But yeah,
that is very fair. Like if you bribe me to release my secret key, it's not only going to be a problem here, right? Like it's just like all the funds that I have will be like you can just extract them. There are other losses that a party would face if it shares its secret key. Uh,
but I guess VRF secret key is different from the other, like not the secret key to the funds, but the VRF key will be different. Just the VRF.
um,
I'll pay you this
yeah,
much.
I'm not particularly sure if I wanted it to be different, but uh, I have not thought of it as different actually. It's to me it is just the same one, but it can be different. I don't know.
Wait, one is a signing key, right? Like the other keys are like signing keys for transactions, and the VRF key is just a VRF evaluation secret key. Why would it be the same?
Um, it can be the same, right? Like it's not necessary to differentiate them, right? Like I'm not sure if it is like if I'm missing something over here, I'm not like
Yeah, yeah,
usually everything is kept separate, but why not?
yeah, yeah. Also requires some secret deposit. Yeah, that also can make sense. All right. Anyway, yeah, I won't
Yeah.
continue talking about this. You can continue the talk. Sorry.
No. I mean, I'm almost at the end of this, where basically, even if you want to stop a single transaction, you'll still have to pay all the parties because, again, as I said, the VRF is not known to the adversary. Um, and the amount that must be bribed is greater than 30 each. Yeah, we see this very nicely increasing censorship resistance chart where if a transaction is paying some fees, it would get a very high bribery tolerance. It would increase by a quadratic factor until some point where it would reach a maximum scaling factor of number of parties. Um, but yeah, so um, that is all that we have. To summarize, AUCIL is the first inclusion list design to work under rational conditions with rigorous analysis of what the validators should select. Um, it tolerates crashes, it is still live, even if there are some theta crashes, without affecting the censorship resistance. Um, and the censorship resistance is high for any phase of the protocol. This is the link to the paper, and you can contact me at any time for follow-ups. Yeah, thank you, and I'll take questions.